The great growth tasted the water world from 40 light minutes out and decided it was already eaten. It thought in sense and pressures, not in words. When the node mind that called itself the reaching bloom drank the light from the blue planet ahead, it knew the things a hunter needs to know. The world was wet. The world was warm. The world was soft. 11 million small, warm bodies moved across its single great ocean, clustered on rafts and floating cities, and the spines of drowned mountains. Soft bodies, slow bodies, bodies made of the same patient chemistry the great growth had unmade on 900 worlds before this one. The bloom spread its sensing veils wide and counted. It counted the salt. It counted the heat. It counted the long, thin clouds dragging across the colony's only continent. It counted the rafts, the towers, the harvest platforms standing on their stilts in the shallows. Then it counted the one thing it did not understand, and because it did not understand the thing, it set the thing aside. The thing hung in a low orbit above the colony. It was long and dark, and it did not move the way living things move. It did not breathe. It did not feed. It gave off no scent of growth, no warmth of blood, no slow chemical hunger. It was cold the way a stone is cold, and gray the way old bone is gray, and the reaching bloom drank its light and found nothing alive in it at all. So the node mind decided the long dark thing was debris, a husk, a dead shell of metal, the kind of inert junk that drifted around so many worlds, left behind by some species too clumsy to keep its own corpses out of the sky. The great growth had passed 1,000 such husks. They never fought. They never grew. They simply hung there, slowly falling, going nowhere. There was a reason the node mind could be so sure. The great growth understood the world through a single sense, deeper and older than sight, the sense of life itself. It could feel a heartbeat across a continent. It could taste the slow chemical fire of a living thing through rock, through water, through the hulls of the fragile ships the soft species sometimes built to flee in. Every enemy it had ever faced had burned, faintly, with that fire, and the great growth had always known exactly where its prey was hiding, because hiding did not put out the fire. You could bury yourself in stone, and the bloom still felt you, the way a cold room still feels the one warm body in it. The long dark thing in orbit had no fire. None. The node mind reached for it with the oldest sense it had, the sense that had never once failed across 900 worlds, and felt nothing at all, the way a hand reaches into a grave and finds it empty. To the great growth, a thing without the fire of life was not an enemy. It could not be. An enemy was a living thing that wished to go on living, and this had no wish in it, no warmth, no spark, nothing the node mind's whole way of knowing the universe could even hold. It was, by the only measure the great growth had ever needed, already dead. That was the trap, not the guns, not the lance. The trap was that the soft bodies had built a hunter their hunters could not see, a thing that killed without the one quality every killer the great growth had ever met possessed, and the node mind, perfect in its old certainty, drifted straight past it without a flicker of alarm. The bloom dismissed it and began to descend. It had done this 900 times. The node mind held the memory of every one of those worlds, the way an old river holds the memory of every flood, not as pictures, but as certainties, deep and slow and never doubted. Worlds of crawling things, worlds of swimming things, worlds that built towers of mud, and worlds that sang to their stars, and worlds that fled screaming across their own continents, while the gray rain came down. Every one of them had been alive. Every one of them had wanted to live. And every one of them, in the end, had become more of the great growth, because the great growth had learned the one truth that mattered across 900 conquests. Everything that lives can be beaten if you are patient, because everything that lives eventually grows tired. And the bloom never grew tired at all. The blue water world would be the easiest yet. So much wet, so much warmth. The node mind had eaten worlds with deserts in them, worlds where the water hid deep underground, and had to be coaxed out a drop at a time. This world wore its water on the outside, an ocean wrapped around the whole of it, warm and green and waiting. The great growth would not have to dig, it would only have to fall. It studied the colony the way a thing that has never lost studies a thing it is about to take. The rafts were anchored, the floating cities moved slowly on the current, too slowly to flee, with no engines large enough to carry 11 million bodies anywhere the bloom could not follow. There were no weapons it could see, no high walls, no teeth. The soft bodies had built their whole world on the surface of the sea, open to the sky, trusting the sky, and the great growth had learned across 900 worlds that a species which trusted the sky had simply never met anything that fell out of it. They would learn. They always learned. The learning never saved them. Far below, inside the long dark thing the great growth had just called dead, a woman named Cora Vane watched a single new point of light slide across her threatboard and did not blink. The ship she stood in was the Guardian-class warship Saltmere, and she had been over this colony for 31 years. Cora had served aboard her for 9 of them. She knew the Saltmere the way a person knows an old house in the dark. Every groan of her plating, every sigh of her coolant, every long, patient breath of her reactor turning in the keel beneath the deck. The Saltmere did not run hot. She did not show her teeth. She sat over the ocean world of Halcyon Deep, with her weapons folded and her engines idle, looking, to anyone who cared to look, exactly like what the great growth had decided she was. A husk. A stone. A dead thing falling slowly nowhere. That was the point. "Contact's gone quiet," said the boy at the sensor station. His name was Reyes, and he was 19, and this was his first hard watch. It was lit up like a city a minute ago. Now it's just sitting there, reading cold. "It's listening," Cora said. "It wants to know if we'll answer." "Should we?" "No." She kept her eyes on the board. The contact had stopped broadcasting the moment it crossed into close range, and that told her something. A dumb thing did not go quiet. A dumb thing did not test the room before it entered. Whatever this was, it had a mind in it somewhere, and that mind was being careful. And a careful predator was a predator that had been hurt at least once in its long life, and remembered the lesson. "What do we know about it?" Cora said. Not a question. A drill. She had run this drill 100 times in exercises, and never once for real. "Almost nothing," Reyes said. He was reading off his board as fast as he could, his voice climbing. "No power signature we recognize. No reaction drive. No comms in any band we monitor. It's not metal, Captain. It's not even mostly solid. The mass reads like water with structure in it, like a storm that learned to hold a shape." He swallowed. "It's the size of a mountain range, and it's moving like it weighs nothing." "Because most of it is hollow," Cora said quietly. "It's not built. It's grown. Everything that's grown is mostly empty space." "Is that good?" "It means it can fold itself small or spread itself thin," she said. "It means it can be in 1,000 places or one. It means when we hit it, the hit goes through a lot of nothing before it finds anything that matters." She finally looked away from the board, at the boy. "No, that's not good." The contact was enormous. The board put it at 31 kilometers across at the widest fold of it, a soft gray mass that bent and flexed against the stars like a living cloud, and the Saltmere's catalog had no name for it, because the Saltmere had never met it before. Nothing in human space had. But Cora had read every after-action report the Guardian fleet had ever filed, 1,100 of them, and 3 of those reports described worlds that had gone silent in exactly this way. A swelling in the dark, a cold pause, then nothing, ever again, where a colony used to be. She had hoped, for 9 years, that those 3 reports were a coincidence. She had even half believed it, on the good days, the long, quiet days when nothing came out of the dark, and the worst thing on the watch was a fishing platform losing power, or a child reported missing, who turned out to be asleep under a dock. 31 years the Saltmere had stood here, and seen nothing worse than weather. A person could start to think the dark was empty. A person could start to think the Guardian ships were a habit the fleet kept out of fear, rather than need. The way a family keeps a lock on a door no one has ever tried. Cora Vane had never let herself think that. She had read the 3 reports too many times. She knew what a silent world looked like from the inside of the only ship that had ever been built to keep one from going silent. She had memorized the last words those 3 colonies had sent before the dark took them, and not one of those colonies had owned a Guardian. That was the only difference she had ever been able to find between the worlds that died and the worlds that did not. A cold gray shape in the sky, and a crew who knew how to use it. "Bring up the colony," she said. "All of it. I want to see what they don't know they're about to need us for. The main display filled with Halcyon Deep, blue and white and turning, its single ocean catching the light of its single sun, its 43 floating cities scattered across the water like seeds across a field. 11 million people. Cora had stood at the rail of 3 of those cities. She knew the smell of the harvest docks at dawn, and the sound the towers made when the wind came off the deep water. And somewhere down there, right now, 11 million people were waking up, or working, or sleeping, none of them looking up, none of them afraid, because that was their right, and the Saltmere existed so that it would stay their right. The thing on the board flexed once, slowly, and turned its great soft face toward Halcyon Deep, and Cora Vane stopped hoping. Reyes was watching the same image. It's going to land on them, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. It's the size of a country, and it's going to come down right on top of them, and they don't even know. It won't land, Cora said. Landing is for things that walk. This thing falls like rain. She watched the gray mass begin, almost lazily, to spread itself wider across the upper dark, thinning at the edges, opening like a hand above the colony. It seeds first. It puts dust in the air, and the dust finds the water, and the water stops being water. By the time anyone down there looks up, the sky is already gray, and the sea is already turning, and the only thing left to do is drown faster than it can eat you. She had read that in one of the 3 reports, the only one whose last transmission had run long enough to describe what was happening. She had read it 9 years ago, and never once been able to unread it. That's what it did to 3 colonies that had no one standing watch. And us? Reyes asked. He was 19. He needed to hear it. What do we do? Cora Vane looked at the thing in the sky that had drunk her ship's light, and called it a corpse. She looked at the colony below it that had no idea anything was wrong. She looked at the long, quiet deck around her, the crew of 41 souls who had trained for this every month of every year, and never believed the day would come, and she felt the old cold clarity settle over her the way it always did before a hard thing, the clarity that had kept her alive, and kept this world alive for 9 long years. We do exactly what we were built to do, she said. We let it come. We let it look at us and see nothing worth fearing. And when it reaches for this colony, we remind it why the other worlds it ate never had a guardian, and why this one always will. Wake the keel, she said. Below her, in the dark, the patient thing the great growth had called debris began, very quietly, to think about killing. The reaching bloom did not descend the way a ship descends. It poured. It let its outer veils thin until they caught the colony's sunlight and turned it into hunger, and it began to fall toward Halcyon Deep in a slow gray rain that covered 4,000 kilometers of upper sky. The great growth had done this 900 times. It knew the shape of the dance. First the seeding, where 1,000,000 spores no larger than dust drifted down into the warm wet air. Then the taking root, where the spores found water and flesh and began to turn both into more of the great growth. Then the swelling, where the new growth fed the node mind, and the node mind grew, and the world below stopped belonging to whatever had lived there and started belonging to the bloom. The water world was perfect for it. So much wet, so much warmth, so many soft, slow bodies that would not even understand what was happening to them until the understanding no longer mattered. There was a pleasure in the falling that the great growth would not have called pleasure, having no word for it, but felt all the same. 900 times it had done this, and 900 times the moment of the first seeding had been the same, the long, slow opening of itself toward a warm world, the certainty of the meal to come. It did not rush. Rushing was for things that could fail. The bloom had never failed, and so the bloom never rushed, and the leisure of its descent was itself a kind of confidence, the confidence of a tide that knows the shore cannot move. Below, the colony went about its small, soft business. The node mind could feel the warmth of the 11 million bodies the way a hand feels the heat of a fire through a closed door. They were down there moving, working, gathering their harvests from the green shallows, raising their young, none of them looking up, none of them afraid, because none of them yet knew there was anything to fear. The great growth had seen this on 900 worlds. The not knowing was the sweetest part. By the time they looked up, the looking would change nothing. The bloom poured, and as it poured, it passed close beside the long dead husk in low orbit, and out of old habit, it tasted the husk one more time. Cold, Gray, inert, dead metal falling slowly nowhere. The node mind felt something that, in a creature with words, would have been contempt. The little dead world even kept its corpses in the sky. How fitting, how soft. The great growth flowed past the husk without slowing, the way water flows past a stone, and reached its first long tendril of spores down into Halcyon's atmosphere. Aboard the Saltmere, Cora Vane watched the gray rain begin to fall on her colony and felt the deck change under her boots. It was a small change. Most of the crew would not have noticed it. But Cora had stood on this deck for 9 years, and she knew the difference between a ship at rest and a ship deciding to move. The long, patient breath of the reactor in the keel deepened. The lights dimmed by a fraction as the Saltmere pulled power back into herself, out of her warm idle systems, into the cold hard ones she had not used in 3 years. Somewhere far back along the spine, the great gun rings began, very slowly, to turn. Power spiking across the weapon grid, Reyes said. His voice had gone thin. Captain, the ship is arming. All of it. Every battery. I know. You didn't give the order. I gave it 31 years ago, Cora said. The day she was built. The Saltmere has standing orders. The first time something tries to seed this world, she stops being polite. She watched the gun rings come up to speed on her board, 16 of them spaced along the spine, each one a ring of dense alloy turning faster and faster, until the numbers blurred. The Saltmere did not throw her rounds with fire and fuel the way the old ships had. She threw them with the gun rings themselves, spinning them up to a speed no eye could follow, and then letting go, so that each slug left the ship already moving faster than any colony shuttle would ever fly, and the only warning the target ever got was the hole appearing through the middle of it. 16 rings. Cora had served on ships with 4. The Saltmere had 16, because the Saltmere had been built to fight the one thing the fleet had hoped never to meet, and she had carried all 16, loaded and silent, for 31 years. Magazines? Cora said. Full, said the weapons officer, a square, steady woman named Vasquez, who had served on 3 Guardians before this one. 40,000 rounds across the rings. We've never fired more than 100 in a single exercise. We'll fire more than that today, Cora said. On the main display, the colony hung blue and helpless beneath its gray shroud. 11 million people, 43 floating cities. Cora had stood at the rail of 3 of those cities. She had eaten fried reef fish on the Calder platform with a man who later became her husband and then later still became a name on a memorial wall, and she had watched children too young to swim learn to swim in the warm green shallows off the Tanhart raft, and not one of those 11 million people had any idea that the sky had just filled with something that wanted to digest them. Open a channel to Halcyon Control, Cora said. Tell them to take every city under the thermocline. All of them. Now. And tell them not to surface for anything, not for any reason, until the Saltmere says the water is clean again. They'll want to know what's happening. Tell them a Guardian is doing her job. Reyes opened the channel. Cora could hear the colony's duty officer come on, a tired voice that had clearly been about to end a long, quiet shift, and then she heard the voice change, as it understood the order it had just been given. 43 cities under the thermocline. 11 million people pulled down into the deep, cold dark where the great growth spores could not follow, where the water pressed too hard and the light could not reach, and nothing that needed warmth could grow. The cities were built to do it. They had been built to do it for exactly this, the way the Saltmere had been built to do what she was about to do, and in 31 years neither had ever been needed. They're submerging, Reyes reported. All 43, Calder platform's the slowest. It's got the deepest harvest rigs to pull in, but they're going down. He listened a moment longer. Captain, Control's asking how long they need to stay under. Until I tell them otherwise. They're asking what to tell the people. Cora thought of the 11 million. She thought of the man on the memorial wall, and the children in the green shallows, and the way a colony of soft, slow bodies had built a single cold gray thing, and trusted it to stand between them and the dark, and had then gone on living, swimming, raising their young, sleeping warm, because they trusted it. Tell them to sleep, Cora said. Tell them the Saltmere is awake. Far below, the cities went under. Cora watched it on the optical feed. 43 vast platforms, slowly drawing in their masts and their docks, and their long harvest rigs. sealing their decks, and sinking into the green water, one after another, until the surface of Halcyon Deep was empty of everything but the spreading gray shroud falling from the sky. On the Calder platform, she could just make out the last of the harvest crews scrambling for the hatches before the water closed over the deck. They did not know what they were running from. They had been told only that a guardian had given an order, and they had obeyed it, because in 31 years, a guardian had never once given an order that turned out to be wrong. That was the trust the Saltmere had earned without ever firing a shot. Today she would have to earn it again, the hard way, the way it had always secretly been meant to be earned. The last hatch on the Calder platform sealed. The last city slid beneath the waves. 11 million people sank down into the cold, dark deep, below the reach of the spores, below the reach of the light, and waited, and trusted. The first spores reached the ocean. Where they touched the water changed. Cora watched it happen on the wide optical feed, and even from orbit, it was wrong in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. The spores hit the surface, and the surface began to thicken, to gray, to crust over in spreading scabs of gray-green matter that ate the light and turned the blue sea the color of a healing wound. The great growth was not landing on Halcyon Deep. It was becoming Halcyon Deep, 1 square kilometer at a time, and it was fast, far faster than anything that size had any right to be. "That's 100 square kilometers in 90 seconds, Reyes whispered. "Captain, at that rate it covers the whole ocean in 11 hours, Cora said. "Less. It speeds up as it grows." She had already done the arithmetic. She did it again, just to be sure, and the number did not improve. "It won't get 11 hours. She put her hand flat on the console, the old gesture, the one she made before every hard thing. "Saltmere," she said. "Show them what you are." The great growth, spread now across 1,000 kilometers of warming sea, felt a new heat bloom against its veils, and did not, at first, understand it. The heat came from the dead husk in orbit. That was the first wrong thing. Dead things did not make heat. The bloom turned a fraction of its vast attention back toward the cold gray shell it had dismissed, and found that the shell was no longer cold. Along its length, in places that had been dark and inert a moment before, the husk had begun to glow, not with the soft warmth of life, with the hard white heat of something building toward release. Rings of the dead metal had turned to face the planet. Long shapes along its spine had opened like the petals of a flower that had been pretending, for 31 years, to be a stone. The node mind had no word for what it was looking at. It had never needed one. In 900 conquests, it had met crawling things and swimming things and flying things and things that built towers of mud and things that sang to their stars, and it had unmade all of them, and not one of them had ever made anything like this. The great growth understood flesh. It understood growth. It understood hunger answering hunger. It did not understand a thing that was not alive choosing, with cold deliberate patience, to point itself at you. There was a wrongness in it that went deeper than danger. The bloom had faced dangerous things before. It had faced fire and poison and the desperate clever weapons of dying worlds, and it had absorbed all of them, because all of them came from things that lived, and a living weapon could be understood and outgrown. But the glow along the husk's spine did not come from anything alive. There was no fear behind it, no hunger, no will the great growth could feel and answer. There was only the cold, deliberate opening of a thing that had been waiting, perfectly still, for the exact moment the bloom came within reach. It had not stirred when the spores fell. It had not stirred when the sea began to gray. It had waited until the node mind was close, and committed, and certain, and only then had it begun to glow. That was not how prey behaved. That was not how anything behaved. Prey ran early, or it ran never. This thing had let the great growth walk all the way up to it, and put a hand on it before it moved at all. And a creature that does that is not afraid of you. And a thing the bloom could not make afraid was a thing the bloom did not know how to fight. So the bloom did the only thing its long, simple history had taught it to do, with something it did not understand. It reached out one tendril of spores, almost gently, almost curious, and touched the glowing husk to taste what it was made of. The tendril found the hull and crawled across it, searching for the soft places every living thing had, the breathing places, the eating places, the warm, wet seams where a body let the world in. There were none. The surface under the tendril was cold and hard and seamless, a single unbroken skin of something the great growth had no chemistry to name, and where the spores tried to root, they found nothing to root into. The husk did not flinch from the touch. It did not pull away. It simply let the tendril crawl across it, the way a stone lets a wave crawl across it, indifferent and unmoved. And that indifference frightened the node mind more than any teeth could have. Everything alive recoiled from the great growth eventually. This thing did not recoil, because this thing did not care. And a thing that does not care is a thing that has already decided how this ends. The Saltmere fired. The first round left the forward ring at a speed the great growth could not have named and would not have believed. It was a single slug of dense alloy, no larger than a market melon, and it crossed the gap between the warship and the descending tendril in less time than it takes a soft body to flinch. It struck the tendril where the tendril joined the main mass of the bloom, and it did not stop there. It punched through 40 kilometers of living gray matter and came out the far side still trailing fire. And where it had passed, the great growth simply was not anymore. A tunnel of nothing, 400 meters wide, bored clean through the flesh of the node mind from one side to the other. The bloom felt pain for the first time in 900 worlds. It was not the pain of a wound. The great growth could lose flesh and not care. It was made of more flesh than 900 oceans could hold. This was a different pain, a deeper and more terrible one. It was the pain of being wrong. The dead husk was not dead. The debris was not debris. The cold gray thing it had dismissed as a corpse 40 light minutes ago was awake and aware. And it had just reached across the void and put a hole through the node mind without any apparent effort at all. And it was already firing again. The second round took the tip of the descending tendril off entirely. The third punched through the main veil. The fourth and fifth and sixth came so fast, the bloom could not feel them as separate things, only as a single long line of agony stitching itself across its body, and the great growth recoiled, hauling its veils back up out of the atmosphere, pulling its spores away from the wounded sea, doing the one thing it had never done on any of the 900 worlds before this one. The rounds did not stop. That was the part the node mind could not make sense of. A living attacker tired. A living attacker spent its venom and had to rest, had to breathe, had to recover before it could strike again. And in that pause, the great growth always won, because the great growth never needed to pause at all. But the cold gray thing did not pause. It did not breathe. The rounds came at a steady, merciless, machine-even rhythm, one after another, each one identical to the last, each one crossing the void in the same eye blink, each one tearing the same clean 400-meter hole through whatever part of the bloom it found. There was no anger in the rhythm. There was no excitement in it. There was nothing in it at all but purpose, and a thing that strikes you with pure purpose, and never once tires, is a thing against which the great growth's whole long history of patience was suddenly, horribly, worthless. It flinched. "Hits confirmed," Reyes said, and his voice had changed again, had gone from thin terror to something close to disbelief. "It's pulling back. Captain, it's pulling back." "It's surprised," Cora said. "It thought we were furniture." She watched the gray mass writhe in orbit, watched the clean dark tunnels she had drilled through it begin, slowly, to close. "It still doesn't know what we are. It thinks this is a bad bite. It thinks it can heal and try again. Can it?" Vasquez answered before Cora could. "We've put 200 rounds through it in 90 seconds, she said, reading her board, her voice flat and careful. "Every hole we drill, it closes inside a minute. We've cut more than 1,000 cubic kilometers out of it, Captain. It hasn't gotten smaller. It's pulling flesh up from somewhere we can't see, deep in the mass, and it's growing the wounds shut faster than we're opening them." She looked up. "We're hurting it. We're not killing it. At this rate, we run the magazines dry in 2 hours, and it's still here." Cora looked at the wound rate on the screen, the way the great growth's flesh flowed back together over the holes the Saltmere had made, and she did the arithmetic a third time, and this time the number was worse than she wanted it to be. "It heals faster than we can cut," she said quietly. "One gun at a time we lose. It's bigger than us. It's always going to be bigger than us." She straightened. "So we don't fight it one gun at a time." "Then how?" Cora studied the gray mass on the board. It had drawn back from the planet, but it had not run. It was holding station now, just out of the atmosphere, healing, gathering, the dark tunnels she had drilled through it sealing over one by one, and she could feel it, thinking out there, the way she could feel a storm thinking before it broke. It was learning her. Every round she fired taught it a little more about what she was, and the more it learned, the more careful it would get. And a careful enemy that healed faster than she could cut was an enemy she could fire at forever and never kill. She needed it to stop being careful. She needed it to make a mistake, and a thing that had never lost in 900 worlds did not make mistakes when it was afraid. It made them when it was certain. We make it commit, Cora said. Right now it thinks it stepped on a thorn. It thinks if it just heals up and tries a different way, it gets the meal anyway. We have to take that away from it. We have to make it believe the only thing in the system worth killing is this ship, and then we have to make it believe it can. She turned from the board. We make it angry enough to stop being careful. We let it think it's winning, and then we stop pretending the saltmere is a stone. Cease fire, Cora said. Vasquez's hand stopped over the board. Captain? Cease fire, all rings, cold the glow, pull the petals closed and make her look dead again. Cora watched the gray mass on the screen, watched it hold there in the high dark, healing, wary, learning. If we keep cutting, it keeps its distance and waits us out. It's smart enough for that now. It learned that lesson in the last 2 minutes, so we unteach it. We give it back the thing it thought it had. We let it believe it caught us with a single weak swipe, and that the swipe is over. And if it just goes back to seeding the planet? It won't, Cora said. It can't. We hurt its pride, and a thing that's never lost has nothing else holding it together but pride. It'll want this ship dead before it touches the colony again. It has to. It can't leave a thing alive behind it that made it bleed, because then it has to wonder what else out here might be able to. She nodded slowly, watching the rings spin down, watching the white glow along the spine fade back to cold gray. We just have to let it come close enough to be sure. The rings went silent, the petals folded, the husk went dark and cold and still, exactly as it had been when the great growth first drank its light and called it a corpse. And to the node mind in the high dark it looked, once again, like a thing that could not hurt it. Captain, Reyes said softly, and there was something new in his voice now. Not terror, not disbelief, but the careful flatness of a person trying very hard to stay calm. It's not coming straight in. It's testing us first. Look. Cora looked. The gray mass had begun to send out thin feelers ahead of itself, long, slender threads of spore matter that drifted toward the saltmere on the faint pressure of her own waste heat. Not the whole body, just fingers. The node mind was no longer charging blind. It had been hurt once, and now it was probing, learning, mapping the cold thing the way a careful hand maps a wall in the dark before it trusts its weight to a door. It's smarter than the last thing that came here, Cora said. There was a last thing? A long time ago, before your time, before mine. She watched the feelers come. Something small, something we burned off in 9 seconds. This is not that. This learned from one bite. In a minute, it's going to know everything about us we let it see. She thought for a moment, the cold clarity working. So we show it only what we want it to learn. Vasquez, when those feelers touch the hull, I want the ship to feel cold, dead cold. Pull every warm system you can to the inner shell, and let the skin go to the temperature of the void. Let it think it touched a corpse that's already going cold. That'll blind half our forward sensors, Vasquez said. We don't need them. We know where it's going to be. Cora's voice was very even. It's going to be everywhere. That's the only place a thing that size knows how to be. The feelers reached the hull. They crawled across the cold dark skin of the saltmere, tasting, searching, and they found exactly what Cora had given them to find. Cold metal, going colder, dead and dimming, a husk whose single brief act of violence had clearly used up the last of whatever strange fire had been hiding inside it. The node mind drew the feelers back, and in the high dark the great growth came to a conclusion. The wrong conclusion. The conclusion a hunter comes to when it has decided what a thing is and will not be told otherwise. The husk was dying. The husk had spent itself. The meal below was waiting, and the only thing standing between the great growth and 11 million soft, warm bodies was a cooling shell that had already thrown its one and only stone. Below them, the wounded sea steamed, and the gray thing in the sky gathered itself, and for the first time in its endless feeding life, the reaching bloom began, slowly, to be afraid, and then, worse, to talk itself out of the fear. The great growth tried to understand the thing that had hurt it, and it failed, and failing made it reckless. The node mind had a kind of memory, the way still water has a kind of memory of every stone ever thrown into it. It went back through 900 conquests looking for anything like the cold gray hunter in orbit, and it found nothing. Every enemy it had ever faced had been alive. Every enemy had wanted things, had feared things, had run or hidden or begged in the chemical language of fear. The great growth knew how to fight the living. You overwhelmed them. You outbred them. You turned their own wet warmth against them and waited, because everything that lived eventually grew tired, and the bloom never grew tired at all. But the husk did not want anything. It did not fear. It did not breed or bleed or beg. It simply hung in the dark, patient as a stone, and reached out at exactly the moment the great growth came within reach, and put holes in things. There was no hunger to turn back on it. There was no fear to feed on. There was only the cold, deliberate machine, doing the one thing it had clearly been built and left here to do, and the node mind had no way to fight a thing that did not live. And then, as the bloom hung healing in the high dark, the husk did something that changed everything. It stopped firing. The rounds simply ceased. One moment and the merciless even rhythm was still tearing tunnels through the node mind, and the next, the husk fell silent, its glowing rings dimming, its long shapes drawing closed, going still and cold and gray again, exactly as it had been before the fight began. To the great growth, which read the living by their hunger and their fear, this could mean only one thing. The husk was spent. It had thrown everything it had, and now it had nothing left, and it was trying to hide inside its old disguise of deadness, and hope the bloom would lose interest and turn back to the easy meal below. The node mind did not know that Cora Vane had given the order to cease fire herself. It did not know she had watched the wound rate climb and made a cold decision, that she had looked at her own gun and understood that the only way to kill a thing this size was to make it believe she could not. It did not know that the silence was bait. The great growth had never in 900 worlds been baited, because nothing it had ever eaten had been patient enough to bait it. It only knew that the cold thing had gone quiet, and a quiet thing was a beaten thing, and a beaten thing could be devoured at last. So it decided to drown the thing instead. The bloom gathered itself. It pulled its scattered veils back into a single dense mass, 31 kilometers of living gray matter compacting down into 19, into 12, into a hard knot of biomass, denser than any flesh the node mind had ever made. It would not flinch again. It would not be cut one tunnel at a time. It would simply throw the whole of itself at the husk at once, wrap every ton of itself around the cold gray shell, and crush it, smother it, dissolve it in acid strong enough to eat through a mountain. Let the husk put its little holes through the great growth. The great growth would close every hole as fast as the husk made it, and there were more tons of bloom than there were rounds in any magazine ever built. It surged toward the saltmere. The descent was not the slow, leisurely pour of the first seeding. This was a thing in a hurry, a thing that had been hurt and meant to make sure it could never be hurt again. And 12 kilometers of compacted biomass fell on the warship with the speed of a collapsing wave. The bloom shed everything that slowed it. It abandoned the spores still drifting in the high air. It abandoned the gray scabs spreading across the sea, let them die where they lay, pulled every living ton of itself up and back and inward, because none of that mattered now. The colony did not matter. The 11 million soft bodies did not matter. Only the cold gray thing mattered, the one thing in 900 worlds that had ever made the great growth feel the pain of being wrong, and the node mind wanted it gone, with a wanting that was almost, in its blind, enormous way, a kind of hate. "It's massing," Reyes said. The disbelief was gone from his voice now. Something harder had replaced it. All of it. The whole thing is coming straight at us. Captain, 12 kilometers of it, and it's accelerating. "Good," said Cora Vane. "Good?" It just stopped spreading out. She watched the gray knot rush toward them across the optical feed, watched it abandon the wounded ocean entirely, watched it pull every spore and tendril and veil, into one furious fist, aimed at the only thing in the system that had ever hurt it. It pulled itself off my colony to come kill my ship. That's all I wanted. Now there's nothing of it left down there to seed the water. It's all up here. It's all in one place. She turned to the weapons station. Vasquez, spin the rings to full, all of them, and open the keel. The weapons officer looked up. She was older than Reyes, older than Cora, a square, steady woman who had served on 3 Guardians before this one and had never once raised her voice. The keel hasn't been opened in flight since the trials, she said. 30 years, Captain. We don't even know if the seals... The seals hold, Cora said. She told me they hold. Open the keel. Deep in the spine of the Saltmere, below the reactor, below the magazines, a long armored hatch that ran nearly the entire length of the ship began to draw back, and the thing that had been sleeping behind it for 31 years opened its single great eye toward the oncoming dark. Far below the fight, in the deep cold water where the cities had sunk, the 11 million felt it come. They could not see it. They could only feel the deep water shudder as the thing in the sky gathered its full weight and fell. A long, low pressure that rolled through the dark and rattled the hatches of the sunken platforms and woke the sleeping children. On the Calder platform, a mother held her child in the red light of the emergency lamps and told it the sound was only thunder, only weather, only the old Guardian doing her job the way she always had, and the child believed her, because everyone on Halcyon Deep believed that, and went back to sleep. They did not know that the Guardian was at that moment buried under a mountain of living acid. They did not need to know. That was the whole point of her. That was the gift she gave them. The gift she had given every day for 31 years and never once asked them to notice. The gift of not having to be afraid. The Guardian-class warships carried a weapon the rest of the fleet did not. It was not a gun. It was not a missile. It was a lance. A single shaft of focused fury that ran the whole length of the keel. And it had been built for exactly one purpose. The purpose that gave the Guardian ships their name. It was built to kill something too big to kill any other way. It had never been fired at a living target. There had never, in all of human history, been a living target large enough to need it. Until now. The great growth, 12 kilometers of compacted hunger, closed the last of the distance and threw itself upon the Saltmere. It hit the warship like an ocean hitting a reef. Gray matter flooded over the hull, poured into every crevice, wrapped around the gun rings and the sensor masts, and the long dark spine, and where it touched the metal it began to eat, sheeting the alloy with acids that smoked and hissed and bit. The bloom felt the husk through every point of contact now, felt the cold of it, felt the strange dead stillness of it, and it poured more of itself onto the shell, and more, certain now that it had won, certain that no amount of cold, deliberate cutting could save a thing that the whole of the great growth had finally gotten its body around. The acids were the node mine's oldest weapon, the one that had unmade 900 worlds. They could dissolve stone, they could dissolve the bones of mountains, and the shells of armored things, and the bright, clever weapons of dying species, given time, and the great growth had nothing if not time. It poured them over the husk and waited to feel the cold gray shell soften and run. The way everything softened and ran in the end. The way everything always had. The shell did not run. The acids smoked against the outer plating and bit 4 layers deep, and then they stopped, defeated by something colder and harder beneath, something the husk had pulled its power into the moment the fight began, and the bloom pressed harder and felt the cold thing simply endure. It did not fight the acid. It did not try to scrape the great growth off. It let itself be swarmed. Let 12 kilometers of biomass wrap around it from end to end, and it endured, patient as a stone, and the node mine took the enduring for weakness, because it had never in 900 worlds met anything strong enough to simply wait inside its grip. It was wrong about that too. Inside the Saltmere, the fight did not look like victory. It looked like the end of the world. The deck heaved under the crew's boots as 12 kilometers of living weight settled over the hull. The lights guttered and went red as the acid found the forward decks and chewed through them, and the long shriek of venting atmosphere ran the length of the ship like a scream. On the cameras, the stars vanished. There was nothing outside the Saltmere now but gray, pressing, moving, hungry gray, sheeting across every lens, every port, every window, so that to the 41 souls aboard, It seemed the whole universe had been swallowed, and only the trembling hull remained. A younger crew might have broken. Cora watched the boy at the sensors grip the edge of his station until his knuckles went white, and she watched him not break, and she was proud of him in a cold, distant way she had no time to show. "Hold your stations," she said, and her voice carried over the shriek of the hull, because she did not raise it. "She has taken worse in the yard. Every breach is forward. Every breach is exactly where I want it. Hold your stations, and trust the ship." They held. But the Great Growth was inside now, and the Great Growth had one last trick, the trick that had finished 100 of the cleverer worlds. Where the acid had opened the forward decks, the node mind pushed spores through the breach, into the warm, wet air of the ship, into the corridors and the conduits, and the long, dark spaces between the bulkheads, looking for the soft things it knew must be hiding inside the cold shell. It had learned this on worlds whose people sealed themselves in bunkers and ships and deep stone vaults. You did not have to break the vault. You only had to find one crack, one breath of warm air leaking out, and you put yourself into the crack and grew. The soft bodies always came apart faster than their walls. "Spore contamination, forward sections," Vasquez said, and her voice tightened for the first time. "It's in decks 1 and 2. It's growing. Fast. It's heading for the crew spaces." "Seal it off," Cora said. "Already done. But it's eating the seals. It'll be through bulkhead 9 in 90 seconds, and then it's in the spine with the rest of us." Cora did not hesitate. "Flood the forward sections," she said. "All of them. Vent them to space, and then flush them with reactor coolant at full cold. Freeze it out. That's a third of the ship, Captain. We lose the forward magazines. We lose the forward sensors. We lose nothing that matters more than the people standing behind bulkhead 9. Cora said. "The Saltmere can fight with 2/3 of herself. She cannot fight with that thing growing in her corridors. Flush it. Now." The forward third of the warship opened to the void. The warm air the spores had been feeding on tore out into the cold, and behind it came the coolant, a flood of liquid colder than any winter the colony had ever known, and where it touched the spreading gray, it stopped the gray dead. The spores did not die quietly. They thrashed and reached and tried to root in the freezing dark, and they failed, every one of them, because the one thing the Great Growth had never learned to grow in was the cold the Saltmere carried in her own veins. The node mind felt its little invasion freeze solid and shatter and drift away as glittering gray dust, and it understood, dimly, that the cold thing had just amputated a third of itself without a moment's grief, and that nothing alive amputates a third of itself to win, and that it was, perhaps, fighting something that did not play by the rules the living had always played by. Then it pushed that understanding down, the way it had pushed down the fear, because the meal was so close, and the Great Growth had never lost. "Contact across the entire hull," Vasquez reported. Her hands moved steady across the board. "Acid breach on the forward plating. Decks 1 through 4 are venting. It's inside the gun rings, Captain. It's got us. It's got all of us." "It thinks it does," Cora said. "Where's the keel?" "Keel is open. Lance is charged, but the target's wrapped right around the muzzle. We fire now. We fire through ourselves." "No," Cora said. "We fire through it." She put her hand flat on the console one more time. The deck shuddered under her boots as the Great Growth's acids chewed into the Saltmere's spine, and she did not move her hand, and her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very calm. It pulled all of itself into one place to crush us. 12 kilometers of it, end to end, lined up perfectly with the keel. It put its whole body in front of the one gun built to kill something its size. She almost smiled. It dressed itself for the funeral. She looked at Reyes, who was 19, and who would remember this for the rest of his life. "Sound the lance," she said. "Captain, the hull." "Sound the lance," Cora said again, "and then hold on to something, because she is about to push back." The lance did not fire the way the rings fired. The rings were quick and cold and casual, a flick of the wrist. The lance was different. The lance had to draw the whole of the ship's heart into a single point, had to pull every watt the reactor could give, and hold it, building, for the long handful of seconds it took to wind a star tight enough to throw. Cora had only felt it once, on the trials, 30 years before she ever took command, and she had never forgotten the feeling, the whole ship leaning into it. the deck going taut as a drawn bowstring, the lights dropping to almost nothing, as the Saltmere poured herself, all of herself, down into the keel. "Charge at 60%, Vasquez called out. The numbers were climbing fast, and the strain was everywhere now, in the groan of the spine, in the deep rising hum that climbed past hearing and settled in the teeth. 70. The acid's into the inner shell, Captain. It found a scar from the last yard refit. It's eating toward the keel. How long on the charge? 8 seconds. The breach reaches the keel in 6. For one moment, one single moment, the arithmetic did not work, and Cora Vane stood in the dark leaning ship and felt the whole of it balanced on the edge of a knife she had spent 9 years sharpening. 6 seconds for the enemy, 8 for the gun, 2 seconds short. On any other ship, with any other crew, 2 seconds short was the end of everything. "Shunt the forward coolant reserve into the keel seal," she said, and she said it the way a person reads a number they have already memorized. "It buys 3 seconds of cold. I worked it out a long time ago, Vasquez. I worked all of it out a long time ago. Do it." The coolant went into the seal. The acid hit the cold and slowed, just enough, and the long rising hum of the lance climbed past the last of itself and held, and the ship at the end of its drawn bowstring stopped leaning, and went, for one breathless instant, perfectly, terribly still. Far below, in the opened keel of the warship, the great growth still believed was a corpse, the lance finished drawing in its breath, and the patient cold thing that had stood over the ocean world for 31 years stopped being patient. The lance fired, and the reaching bloom finally understood what it had wrapped itself around. The shaft of light left the keel of the Saltmere and went through the great growth, the way truth goes through a lie. It did not bore a tunnel. It did not punch a hole. It opened the node mind from one end to the other, 12 kilometers of compacted living matter, laid open along its whole length in a single instant of white heat, and where the lance passed, the bloom did not heal, because there was nothing left to heal with. The flesh did not close over the wound. The flesh was gone, cooked to vapor, blown out into the cold in a long bright plume that the floating cities of Halcyon Deep would see in their sky for 3 nights afterward, and never forget. The plume could be seen across the whole face of Halcyon Deep. From the deep water where the cities hid, the 11 million did not see it, but the instruments of the sunken platforms felt the sky above them blaze white for a single second, and then go dark again, and the duty officer on the Calder platform wrote 3 words in the log, and could not, afterward, remember writing them. The water shuddered one final time, and then it went still, stiller than it had been in hours, the long deep stillness of a thing that is over. The node mind felt itself end along the center of its own body. It had never felt this before. It had felt pain, an hour ago, for the first time in 900 worlds. But pain was a small thing. Pain meant flesh, and flesh could be regrown. This was not pain. This was the lance reaching into the very place where the great growth kept itself, the dense knot of node tissue at its core, where all its thinking, and all its hunger, and all its long, simple memory lived, and the lance went through that place without slowing, the way it had gone through everything else, and the bloom felt its own thoughts come apart. There had been a reason the great growth kept its core at its center. On 900 worlds, the center had been the safest place there was, buried under tons of expendable flesh, untouchable behind a wall of itself, 100 kilometers deep. Nothing alive could ever dig through that much biomass fast enough to reach the thinking heart of the bloom, before the bloom drowned it. The center was a fortress. The center was the one place the node mind had never once had to fear. And then, it had taken 12 kilometers of itself, and folded it tight, and wrapped it lovingly around the muzzle of a gun, built to do exactly one thing, and the gun had reached straight down the center, straight to the fortress, straight to the thinking heart, and the wall of flesh that had kept it safe for 900 worlds had only made the target longer. The great growth had not protected its core. It had handed it over. It had lined the most precious part of itself up perfectly with the one weapon in the galaxy that could find it. And then, it had held still and let the weapon take its time. In the last clear moment before the core failed, the great growth understood 3 things, all at once, and far too late. It understood that the husk had never been debris. It had been a guardian, set deliberately over this world by the soft, slow bodies the bloom had come to eat. Set here decades ago, and left to wait, patient as a stone, for exactly this. The corpse in the sky had been a trap with a heartbeat the node mind had been too proud to hear. It understood that the soft, slow bodies were not prey, a thing that built a guardian like this, and trusted it, and slept warm beneath the waves while it stood watch, was not soft at all. It only looked soft, the way the husk had only looked dead. The great growth had eaten 900 worlds because it could always tell the strong from the weak by their warmth and their hunger and their fear. It had never once met a strength that ran cold, and chose its moment, and showed no hunger at all. And it understood, last of all and worst of all, that it had done this to itself. Nothing had forced it to mass into a single knot. Nothing had forced it to wrap its whole body around the one gun built to kill its kind. The husk had not even tried very hard to stop it. The husk had simply let the bloom believe it was winning, let it pull itself together, let it line itself up muzzle to core, and then it had pushed back, once, the way it had clearly always meant to. The great growth had not been defeated. It had been allowed to defeat itself, and the cold, patient thing had only had to wait, and waiting was the one thing in all the galaxy the great growth could not outlast. There was a final thing the node mind reached for, in its last clear instant, and could not find. It reached for the certainty. The certainty had always been there, deeper than thought, deeper than hunger, the bedrock of 900 conquests. Everything that lives can be beaten. The great growth had built its whole long existence on that single stone, and the stone had never once cracked, because everything the bloom had ever met had in fact been alive, and everything alive had in fact been beaten. The certainty had never failed because the certainty had never been tested. And now, far too late, in the white heat of the lance, the node mind understood that the cold gray thing was not the exception to the rule. The cold gray thing was the proof that the rule had always been a lie. There had simply never, until this afternoon, been anything in the galaxy patient enough to show the great growth the truth. The core failed. The node mind that called itself the reaching bloom came apart into 19 million separate pieces of dying gray matter, each one no longer a part of anything, each one no longer thinking, each one falling back away from the warship into the long, cold dark, and the thing that had eaten 900 worlds simply stopped being a thing at all. Aboard the Saltmere, the deck rang like a struck bell, and then went still. For a long moment, no one spoke. The recoil of the lance had thrown them all against their straps, hard, harder than any drill, and now the great pressure that had been crushing the hull was simply gone. The gray lifted away, the stars back in the ports where there had been nothing but hunger a heartbeat before. The red light steadied to amber and then to white. The shriek of venting air faded as the bulkheads sealed the forward decks away. The ship that had been buried under a mountain of living acid 1 second ago hung clean and quiet in her orbit the next, scarred and smoking and whole. And the crew of 41 breathed, all of them at once, the held breath of people who had not let themselves believe they would breathe again. "Lance fired," Vasquez said. She was holding the edge of her console with both hands. "Lance fired clean. Target is..." She stopped. She checked the board again, and a third time, the way Cora had checked her arithmetic. "Target is gone, Captain. It's not retreating. It's not regrouping. It's just gone. It came apart. The whole thing came apart." Reyes was staring at the optical feed, where the great bright plume of the dead node mind hung in the sky over the colony, slowly cooling, slowly drifting apart. "It was 12 kilometers across," he said, to no one. "It ate 900 worlds, and it came apart." He turned from the feed at last, back to his captain, and asked the thing the whole crew was thinking. "Why us?" he said. "Why did it work? It was 1,000 times our size. It healed everything we threw at it. It had us in its hand. By every number on this board we should be dead. Because it fought us the way it fights the living," Cora said. "And we're not the living, not the way it understands the word." She gestured at the cooling sky. Everything it ever ate had something it wanted, a life it was trying to keep. It learned to find that thing and squeeze it until the prey gave up. That's the whole of what it knows. Find the want and break it. She shook her head slowly. "We don't have a want it can find. The Saltmere doesn't fear dying because the Saltmere was already..." by everything it could feel, dead. You can't threaten a corpse. You can't starve a stone. You can't make a machine flinch by hurting it, because the machine doesn't care that it's been hurt. It only cares about the one thing it was built to do, and it will go on doing that thing while it falls apart around the doing of it. That's not courage, Reyes. Courage is a living thing's word. This is something the galaxy out there doesn't have a word for yet. It came apart because it never understood what it was fighting, she went on, quieter now. It spent 900 worlds learning to kill living things. It met the Saltmere, and it had nothing. No instinct for us. No memory of us. We don't breathe and we don't bleed, and we don't run. And a thing like that, a thing that only knows how to eat, has no idea what to do with a thing that only knows how to wait. She let go of the console at last. Her hand had been pressed flat against it the whole time. It thought patience was death. It saw a cold thing that didn't move, and it called it a corpse. It never once considered that a cold thing that doesn't move might just be a thing that has decided exactly when it's going to. Reyes turned from the feed. He was 19, and he had a question, and he did not know how to ask it gently, so he asked it plainly. You let it grab us, he said. You held fire. You let it cover the whole hull. You let it breach the forward decks. We could have lost the ship. No, Cora said. We couldn't. That's the part you have to understand, if you're going to do this job after I'm gone. She looked at the boy steadily. I knew what the Saltmere could take, down to the deck, down to the second. I knew the acid would stop at the inner shell, because I knew the inner shell. And I knew the lance would clear before the breach reached the keel, because I knew the keel. None of it was a gamble. It looked like a gamble to the bloom. That's why it worked. A thing that can't tell the difference between a guardian holding still, and a corpse can't tell the difference between a trap and a mistake either. She nodded once, slowly. We didn't risk the ship. We spent exactly what we could afford, and not 1 gram more. That's not luck, Reyes. That's 31 years of knowing her. The damage reports were coming in now. The forward decks were open to the void. The acid had eaten through 4 layers of plating and stopped at the 5th, the cold, hard inner shell the Saltmere had pulled her power into when the fight began. The gun rings were scored and pitted. 3 sensor masts were gone. The keel hatch was warped from the heat of the lance and would need a yard and a month to close again. But the reactor turned, steady and patient, in the spine, and the inner shell held, and not one of the 11 million people beneath the waves had felt anything more than a long roll of thunder in a clear sky. Casualty report, Cora said. None, Vasquez said. There was something in her voice that had not been there before, something quiet and amazed. We're hurt, Captain. We're hurt bad, but we didn't lose anyone. She kept the breaches forward. She kept us all in the back. Vasquez shook her head. She knew exactly how much of herself she could afford to give up. Cora looked at the long list of wounds her ship had taken, every one of them in the front, every one of them where a body steps to take a blow meant for the people behind it. She always does, Cora said. Below them, the wounded sea of Halcyon Deep was already beginning to heal, the gray scabs of dead great growth breaking up in the warm green water, sinking, dissolving, becoming nothing more than a strange gray silt the reef fish would pick clean within a season. The blue was coming back. The light was coming back to the water. By morning, the floating cities would surface, and the children would learn to swim again, in shallows that had nearly become a grave, and not one of them would ever know how close it had come. That was the point. That had always been the point. Open the channel to Halcyon Control, Cora said. Tell them the water is clean. Tell them they can surface at first light. She paused. And tell them the Saltmere held. Just that? Reyes asked. Cora Vane looked at the cooling sky, and the healing sea, and the long, dark, patient shape of her ship laid out beneath the stars, with her wounds all worn in the front. They'll understand, she said. They've always understood. That's why they sleep so well. The galaxy heard about Halcyon Deep before the colony's children had finished their breakfast. The great growth had never been alone. That was the thing the wider dark learned that morning, the thing that crawled outward at the speed of fear through every species that had ever watched the node mind eat a world and been grateful it was not their turn. The reaching bloom had been only one of its kind. There were others, drifting between the stars, vast and patient and certain, each one with its long, simple memory of 900 conquests, each one sure that the soft, wet worlds were theirs for the taking, and that nothing cold and quiet had ever been a threat. They had divided the galaxy's living worlds among themselves, the way children divide a meal, and not one of them had ever lost a single bite. Then one of them touched a blue water world, and called the guardian over it a corpse, and came apart into 19 million pieces in a single afternoon. The death of a node mind was not a quiet thing across that whisper. When a thing the size of a mountain range that has eaten 900 worlds comes apart in a single afternoon, the ending of it travels. The other node minds had felt their kind die before, rarely, at the hands of stars that flared without warning, or worlds whose crust split and swallowed a young bloom before it could spread. Those deaths had been clean and meaningless, the random cruelty of dead matter, nothing to fear, and nothing to learn from. This death was different. This death had a shape. This death came with a memory attached to it, the last memory of the reaching bloom, and the memory was the worst thing the great growth had ever tasted, because the memory was of being outthought. The other node minds felt it happen. They were connected the way deep roots are connected, through the slow, long whisper of the dark. And when the reaching bloom died, they all felt the place where it had been go suddenly, permanently silent. They tasted the last thing it had understood, carried to them on that dying whisper, and the last thing it had understood was the cold, patient shape of the saltmere, and the 3 terrible truths it had learned far too late. The husk was not debris. The soft bodies were not prey, and the cold thing had not been defeated. It had simply waited, and let the great growth do the rest. The surviving node minds did the arithmetic. They were good at arithmetic. 900 worlds will teach a thing to count. They counted the cost of the blue water world, and they counted the 11 million soft bodies who had slept warm beneath the waves, while a god of hunger died in their sky, and they counted the one cold, quiet guardian, who had done it without losing a single life, and the numbers did not improve no matter how many times they ran them. There was something else in the numbers, too, something the node minds did not have a word for, any more than they had a word for the cold gray shape. They had always known how many worlds there were, and how many were theirs, and the answer had always been the same, all of them, in time. The galaxy was a meal that had not yet been finished, and the great growth had been finishing it for longer than the soft species had been climbing down out of their trees. The eating had never had an end in sight, because nothing had ever been able to put an end in front of it. Now there was an end. It was small. It was one world, one cold gray shape, one afternoon. But it was the first time in the whole long history of the great growth that the answer to the question how many worlds are ours had changed from all of them to all of them but one, and a number that can change once, can change again. And the node minds, who were so very good at arithmetic, understood that better than anything alive could have. They had spent an age certain that time was on their side, that they had only to keep eating and keep waiting, and the galaxy would fall to them grain by grain. And now they had met a thing made entirely of waiting, a thing that did patience better than they did, a thing for which an afternoon and a century were the same cold, motionless thing, and they understood that the long game they had always been sure of winning had quietly, that morning, stopped being theirs to win. So the great growth, for the first time in its long and terrible history, marked a world it would not eat. It did not understand the warship. It would never understand the warship. That was the heart of the horror, the thing that spread node mind to node mind through the long whisper of the dark, and never stopped spreading. A thing you understand, you can fight. The other node minds knew how to fight the living, knew it down in their oldest tissue, the way the reaching bloom had known, but they had no instinct for the cold, quiet thing over the water world, no memory to draw on, no way to even name what it was. It did not breathe. It did not bleed. It did not run or hide or beg. It only waited, patient as a stone, and chose its moment, and the choosing had killed the largest living thing the galaxy had ever made, as easily as a hand closing on a fly. You cannot starve a thing that does not hunger. You cannot outlast a thing made of waiting. You cannot frighten a thing that has no warmth to cool. The great growth had spent its whole existence learning that everything alive could be beaten, given time, and then it had met a thing that was not alive, and had no idea what to do. One of the surviving node minds, the eldest and the largest, a bloom that had eaten more than 2,000 worlds across an age longer than the colony's whole recorded history, reached out along the whisper toward the silent place where the reaching bloom had been. It did this the way a careful animal sniffs at the body of one of its own kind, found dead on a trail, searching for the thing that had done the killing, hoping to learn the predator's scent so it could be hunted in turn. The eldest bloom had done this before. It had always, before, found a scent it knew, a flare, a quake, a poison, something dead and blind and beatable. This time it found nothing it could hunt. It found only the cold gray shape and the three truths, and underneath them, a fourth thing the reaching bloom had not lived quite long enough to put into thought, but had felt all the same in its final instant, and the eldest bloom tasted that fourth thing and recoiled from it across the whole width of the dark. The fourth thing was this. The cold gray shape had not been hunting the great growth at all. It had not gone looking. It had simply stood over one small world for 31 years, doing nothing, wanting nothing, and waited for the great growth to come to it. The killer had not chased the prey. The killer had been left in the open like a baited hook by something that was not even present, something that had built it and trusted it and gone to sleep, and the reaching bloom had swum up to the hook and taken it, because the hook looked dead. The eldest bloom understood, in that moment, that it could not hunt a thing that did not hunt. There was no scent to follow back. There was only the patient cold shape, anywhere, everywhere, over any world the soft bodies chose, and no way to ever know which world, until you were already inside its reach. The eldest bloom turned away from the silent place. It had eaten more worlds than any of its kind, and it had not done so by lingering near things it could not understand. But as it withdrew along the whisper, it did one last thing, a thing the great growth had never once needed to do in all its long devouring history. It remembered a defeat. It folded the cold gray shape, and the three truths, and the fourth worst truth, deep into the oldest part of itself, the part that held the certainties, and it set them there beside the one certainty that had just been broken, so that the broken stone would never be forgotten, and never be tested again. Everything that lives can be beaten. The eldest bloom kept that. But beneath it now, carved deeper, was the new thing, the thing the water world had taught the whole of the great growth in a single afternoon. Not everything that kills you is alive. Some of the deadliest things in the dark do not hunger at all. They only wait. And a thing that only waits cannot be starved, cannot be outlasted, cannot be made afraid, and must never, under any pressure, for any meal, be mistaken for a corpse. The blue water world went onto a list. There was only one world on the list, that morning, but the list existed now, and a list that exists can grow, and every node mind that touched the long whisper of the dark and tasted the death of the reaching bloom added its own quiet certainty to the warning. Avoid the cold, quiet things. Avoid the worlds where the corpse in the sky might not be a corpse. Avoid above all the soft, slow bodies who sleep warm beneath the waves and trust something cold and patient to keep them, because a species that builds a thing like that and leaves it and rests is not soft at all. It only looks that way. Everything about it only looks that way, right up until the moment it decides, and by then, it is much too late to learn. Aboard the Saltmere, none of this was known. Cora Vane stood at the rail of the observation deck 3 days later and watched the floating cities of Halcyon Deep come up out of the sea. They rose one at a time, 43 of them, breaking the green surface in long sheets of falling water, their towers catching the morning light, their decks already crowding with people who had slept through the end of the world and woken to a clear blue sky. On the Calder platform, far below, a child she would never meet was learning to swim in the warm shallows where, 3 days before, the great growth had begun to turn the sea into a grave. She had given the order to surface herself, at first light, when the last of the gray silt had broken up and sunk, and the water had run clean blue again from horizon to horizon. She had watched the first city rise, and felt something she had no name for, the same thing she felt every time the colony went on living, only larger now, sharpened by how close it had come. The people did not cheer. They did not know there was anything to cheer for. They came up out of the deep dark believing they had ridden out a storm, a bad one, the worst in living memory, and they shook the water off their decks and opened their markets and went back to the long, ordinary business of being alive. By noon, the harvest boats were out again on the clean blue water. By evening, the towers were lit. Somewhere down there, a band was playing, the sound too faint to reach orbit. But Cora knew it was playing, because the colony always played when a storm had passed, and to them, this had only been a storm. One message had come up from the surface, that first morning, addressed to the ship and not to the fleet. It was from the duty officer on the Calder platform, the one who had written 3 words in the log and could not remember writing them. The message was short. It said only that the platform's deep instruments had recorded something during the storm that the colony's scientists could not explain, a pressure and a light and a long silence after, and that whatever it had been, the officer wished to thank the Saltmere for it, in case it mattered. Cora had read the message twice and then filed it without answering. There was nothing to say that the colony would understand, and nothing she wanted them to understand. Let them think it was a storm. A world that has to know what stands in its sky is a world already half lost. The whole of her work, the whole of the Saltmere's long patient purpose, was to make sure they never had to know at all. She thought about the child learning to swim. She thought about how that child would grow up on a world that had never been eaten, would have children of its own on a world that had never been eaten, would die old on a world that had never been eaten, and would never once, in all that long, safe life, have a reason to look up at the cold gray shape in the sky and wonder what it was for. That was the gift. That was the only gift that had ever mattered, not gratitude, not memory, just the long, ordinary, unhaunted business of being alive, going on, beneath a sky someone else had agreed to watch. She had given 31 years to that gift, the Saltmere had, and 9 of them had been Cora's, and she knew now that she would give the rest of hers too, however many were left, standing this same watch over this same warm water, because the dark was deeper than 3 reports and 3 dead colonies, and the thing they had killed today had not been the only one of its kind. She had felt that, in the way it fought, the long, sure patience of a thing that had done this many times before and expected to do it many times again. There would be others. There would always be others, and the Saltmere would be here, cold and quiet and ready, for every single one of them, for as long as there were children who needed to learn to swim in a sea that no one had turned into a grave. The Saltmere held her low orbit the way she had held it for 31 years, her wounds all worn in the front, her keel warped and her plating scored, and her great patient reactor turning steady in her spine. The yard ships had begun to gather around her, small and bright against her long dark shape, ready to begin the slow work of making her whole again. They would close the keel. They would patch the front. By the next time something came out of the dark and called her a corpse, she would be ready, exactly as she had been ready this time, exactly as she would always be ready, because that was the one thing she had been built and left here to be. Cora had read the first messages from the fleet that morning. They wanted reports. They wanted the lance data, the wound rates, every number she had, because 1,100 Guardian ships stood over 1,100 worlds, and now, for the first time, the fleet knew what those ships had been waiting for all along. There would be changes. There would be drills that were no longer just drills. Somewhere out past Halcyon Deep, other captains were standing on other quiet decks, reading the same report Cora had filed, and learning the same thing she had learned, looking down at a sea that had nearly become a grave. The Guardians were not a habit kept out of fear. They had never been. They were a promise the soft, slow bodies had made to themselves a long time ago, in the dark. And the promise was simple. We will look harmless. We will look soft. We will sleep warm beneath the waves, and let the galaxy believe we are easy. And we will leave one cold, patient thing in the sky over every world we love, and we will trust it, completely, and we will be right to. They're asking what to call it, Reyes said, coming up beside her at the rail. He was not 19 anymore. Not really. Something in him had aged past his years in a single afternoon. The thing we killed. The fleet wants a name for the records. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. Cora watched the cities rise. They never named themselves, she said. Not in any way we could hear. They just came, and ate, and moved on, 900 times, and never once needed a name, because nothing they met ever lived to ask for one. She thought about it. Call them the Great Growth then. That's the closest thing to what they thought they were. The thing that grows over everything, forever, because nothing can stand against it. And us? Reyes said. What do the records call us? Cora Vane looked at the long, dark shape of her ship, patient and scarred and whole, hanging cold and quiet over a world full of warm, sleeping bodies who would never know how close it had come, and never need to. They don't need a name for us, she said. The ones who come next will know exactly what we are. She turned from the rail. They'll have heard. Out there in the dark, they'll have heard what happens when you mistake a guardian for a corpse. And the next time one of them drinks the light from a blue water world and finds a cold gray thing in orbit that doesn't breathe, and doesn't bleed, and doesn't move at all, it won't call it debris. She paused at the hatch and looked back once at the rising cities, and the healing sea, and the silent, patient ship. It'll call it the last thing it ever sees, Cora said, and it'll be right.